On a bitter December morning in 1905, in a suite overlooking Fifth Avenue, the man who had bought and sold the arteries of two great cities lay gasping, surrounded not by family or friends, but by lawyers counting his sins. The snow fell in thick, deliberate sheets against the windows of the Waldorf Astoria, each flake vanishing against the glass like another dissolving second of a life, measured in franchises and betrayals. The winter light filtering through the heavy velvet curtains was thin and indifferent, the kind of pale gray that drained color from the world, and left only the stark geometry of shadows and privilege. Inside this sanctuary of mahogany and silk, the air hung thick with camphor, expensive cologne, and the metallic tang of approaching dissolution. Charles Tyson Yerkes lay propped against a mountain of silk pillows that had cost more than most men earned in a year. His breathing shallow and irregular, each inhalation a negotiation his failing body was losing. At 68, he looked ancient, his once commanding frame reduced to a collection of sharp angles beneath Egyptian cotton sheets. The face that had once intimidated aldermen and charmed British aristocrats was now the color of old parchment, skin so translucent that the blue network of failing veins showed through like ink bleeding through expensive paper. His right hand, the hand that had signed away cities, purchased legislatures, and mortgaged the future of millions, trembled as it reached toward the bedside table. The fingers, mottled and weak, searched for the gold-nibbed fountain pen that lay among the scattered instruments of his earthly obsessions. Around him, documents formed a chaotic shrine to avarice. Urgent telegrams from London bearing the seals of banking houses, their yellow edges curling in the dry heat. Legal contracts bound in red silk ribbon, each one representing millions of dollars in obligations that existed only because this dying man had willed them into being. Ticker tape printouts from the previous day's closing, the numbers already meaningless in the face of mortality. The pen slipped from his grasp, clattering against a crystal water glass. One of the three lawyers standing at respectful distance near the door moved forward to retrieve it, his face carefully arranged into professional sympathy that never quite reached his calculating eyes. These men had not been summoned to comfort but to witness, to ensure that whatever transpired in this velvet-draped tomb would be legally binding, financially enforceable, properly documented for the battles to come. They formed a tribunal of sorts, these attorneys and financial agents, speaking in the cool, measured tones of men discussing an estate rather than a person. No one held his hand. No one whispered reassurances. Instead, they murmured about asset liquidation, bond protection, the necessity of moving quickly before the London papers sensed weakness. The Piccadilly line might fetch decent value, one observed quietly, if we move before the investors panic. The Underground Electric Railways Company bonds must be protected, another replied. If they sense he's weaker than we're admitting, there'll be a run we cannot contain. They called him Mr. Yerkes, never Charles. There was no wife at his bedside. His first had divorced him after the prison sentence. His second lived separately. Their marriage a legal fiction maintained for appearance. No children smoothed his fevered brow. They were scattered, estranged, their inheritances long since spent or withheld out of spite. The only person in the room who appeared to feel genuine emotion was Emily Grigsby, his companion 40 years his junior, seated at a discreet distance with gloved hands clenched in her lap. Even she was calculating now, her telegram about funeral arrangements and jewelry lying among the others on his nightstand. Through the fog of uremia clouding his mind, memories surfaced unbidden. Eastern State Penitentiary, 1871. Stone walls, iron bars, the sound of his cell door closing for the first time. He had been 34 then, a convicted embezzler, whose Philadelphia brokerage empire had crumbled when he gambled $428,000 of the city's money on stocks that turned worthless in the Great Chicago Fire Panic. In that cell, he had learned the fundamental truth that shaped the next 34 years. In America, there were only two unforgivable crimes: being poor and getting caught. He had committed the second, but would never again commit the first. Even now, as his organs failed, his empire continued its relentless operation. 1,000 miles west, in the freezing wind of Chicago, elevated trains screamed around the loop, on tracks he had built with bribery and extortion. Every rivet in those rails had been paid for with dirty money, every pillar supporting them above the streets a testament to an alderman he had purchased or a competitor he had destroyed. The citizens of Chicago had driven him into exile when he demanded a 99-year monopoly, marching in the streets with nooses bearing his name. Yet at this very moment, hundreds of thousands of them were handing over their nickels to ride his trains, breathing fog against windows as they traveled on the infrastructure of his greed. Across the Atlantic, in the deep clay beneath London, his final gamble played out in darkness. He had arrived in England as a pariah, audaciously promising to electrify the underground, floating £18 million in bonds while dazzling British society with his American confidence. The Bakerloo and Piccadilly lines were operational now, electric marvels carrying millions, but the financial structure supporting them was so precarious that only he understood how close to collapse it truly was. The ultimate irony suffocated him with its perfection. Here lay a man obsessed with perpetuity, who had fought wars over 99-year leases and destroyed careers to secure 50-year franchises. He had drafted contracts designed to grant his companies rights of way lasting until the end of time, had built a 60-room mansion filled with stolen Rembrandts and Titians, creating a palace meant to house a dynasty for centuries. He had spent 40 years purchasing time, 50-year franchises, 99-year leases, perpetual rights of way. In the end, the only time he could not buy was his own. The gilded clock on the mantelpiece ticked with mechanical precision, each second advancing with impartial indifference toward the moment when signatures would no longer matter, when the vast paper empire would either stabilize or dissolve entirely. His eyes, still burning with cold intelligence, despite the kidney failure poisoning his blood, fixed on a particular document concerning his London ventures. It required only his signature to authorize asset sales, restructure debts, prevent investigations. Without it, everything might collapse within weeks. His hand moved toward the pen one final time, trembling with the effort. The lawyers leaned forward expectantly. Outside, snow continued falling on Fifth Avenue, covering the city in temporary purity that morning traffic would soon grind into gray slush. The breathing in the bed grew more labored, more irregular, as if even this basic function had become another negotiation he was destined to lose. But to understand how a convicted embezzler from Philadelphia became the invisible hand that moved Chicago's streets and London's tunnels, and why he died with more enemies than heirs, we must return to the first deal he could never escape. Long before he was a magnate, Charles Tyson Yerkes was merely a prodigy of avarice. Born in 1837 to Quaker parents in Philadelphia, a city that prized sobriety yet secretly genuflected before wealth, he arrived in a world of exquisite contradictions that would shape his understanding of power forever. Philadelphia in the decades before the Civil War presented itself as a monument to moral rectitude, where Quaker values supposedly governed both commerce and conscience. The cobblestone streets were swept clean each morning. Gas lamps illuminated orderly corners where respectable merchants conducted respectable business, and the architecture itself seemed to preach restraint. Yet beneath this facade of propriety ran currents of ambition as fierce as any frontier boomtown. This was the beating financial heart of the young republic, where men in plain dress spoke in measured tones while calculating interest rates with ruthless precision. Young Charles learned early that morality was performed for those without capital, while the true religion of Philadelphia was practiced in counting houses where abstract numbers determined whether families prospered or starved. His father, a provision dealer and sometime banker, belonged to a faith that valued silence, inward reflection, and the rejection of worldly ostentation. But the streets beyond the calm Quaker meeting houses told a different story entirely. Here was a city where piety was social currency, but money was the only reality that truly mattered. Charles possessed an intelligence that bypassed childhood entirely, fixing itself on the mechanisms of accumulation with the intensity of a seminarian studying sacred texts. While other boys played at soldiers or memorized scripture, he haunted the edges of his father's world, observing the rituals of finance with predatory fascination. At 15, he abandoned formal education to become a clerk at a grain brokerage, a position that would have been merely tedious for most adolescents, but which Charles transformed into a graduate education in the architecture of capitalism. In cramped offices that smelled of ink, sweat, and cigar smoke, he witnessed how fortunes could be summoned and destroyed with nothing more than a signature. Men in silk hats and tailored coats, their faces composed in masks of calm, gambled entire industries on whispers and rumors. He watched how one man's hesitation could cost him thousands, how another's speed could earn him 10 times as much. The revelation that would define his life crystallized during those early years. The real currency was not gold or paper, but time itself. If you knew before the public knew, you could own the public. Information was valuable only in the brief window between acquisition and dissemination. The man who acted in that window became rich. The man who hesitated became a cautionary tale whispered in the shadows of the exchange. The telegraph became his first real accomplice. Philadelphia's growing network of wires allowed messages to outrun trains and ships, and in modest telegraph offices staffed by men whose fingers never ceased moving, he discovered a new theater of power. Ink-stained ledgers recorded transactions that shifted value from one coast to another. A few minutes' advantage on a bond price in New York, a slightly earlier report on a railroad's expansion, a whisper about a city council's decision on new paving contracts. These were the secrets that separated those who merely earned a living from those who devoured lives. By age 22, impossibly young by the standards of Philadelphia's financial establishment, Charles Yerkes opened his own brokerage house. The audacity was breathtaking. A boy barely old enough to vote claiming equality with men who had spent decades building reputations. Yet he possessed something they lacked, an understanding that reputation itself was merely another asset to be leveraged, bought, or manufactured as circumstances required. His specialty became municipal bonds and railroad stocks, instruments that existed at the intersection of public policy and private profit. These were not abstract securities, but physical realities. Bonds determined which neighborhoods received streetlights and sewers, which districts flourished, and which decayed into slums. Railroad stocks meant controlling the arteries of commerce, deciding which towns thrived and which withered when the tracks bypassed them. Yerkes understood that he was not merely trading paper, but trading the future itself, parceling out prosperity to those willing to pay his price. The key to his meteoric success lay in a relationship he cultivated with meticulous care. City Treasurer Joseph Marcer, a man whose position gave him control over Philadelphia's public funds. Together, they orchestrated a scheme that possessed an elegant simplicity that would have impressed a Renaissance prince. Marcer would temporarily deposit city money, tax dollars meant for streets, schools, and sewers, into Yerkes's brokerage accounts. This massive influx of public capital would then be used for private speculation, buying low and selling high, leveraging the city's own weight to tip the scales in their favor. When investments succeeded, they would return the principal to the Treasury as if it had never left, splitting the substantial profits between them. When investments failed, there was always more city money coming in. Tax revenues, new bond issues, routine transfers. Losses could be hidden, at least temporarily, in the vast opaque machinery of public finance. It was financial alchemy, creating gold out of nothing but public trust and private risk. The arrangement flourished spectacularly. Philadelphia society, always hungry for new members to validate its own prosperity, embraced the young financier with enthusiasm. Custom-tailored suits began arriving from London, cut from fabric so fine it whispered against itself when he moved. He married Susanna Gamble, daughter of a respectable family, a union that conferred legitimacy more valuable than any stock certificate. They purchased a palatial mansion on Girard Avenue, one of those imposing structures that announced permanence, dynasty, arrival. Club memberships followed: the Union League, the Philadelphia Club. Sanctuaries where men who had inherited their wealth grudgingly admitted men who had stolen theirs. He cultivated the appearance of conservative prudence, speaking in measured tones about fiduciary responsibility, while privately viewing his client's capital as raw material to be refined into his own fortune. His brokerage house became known for reliability, which in Philadelphia meant predictability, and boring was precisely the disguise that allowed him to operate with impunity. The golden era lasted a decade, each year adding another layer of respectability to a foundation built entirely on fraud. He became the embodiment of what Philadelphia wanted to believe about itself: that wealth and virtue were synonymous, that success proved moral superiority, that a man who prospered must have earned his prosperity through qualities worth emulating. The city saw him as proof that the system worked, that talent and industry were rewarded, that America's promise of upward mobility was real, rather than mythology designed to pacify the desperate. Yet even during those years of triumph, Yerkes operated with a peculiar recklessness that suggested he understood the precariousness of his position. He took risks that more cautious embezzlers would have avoided, making larger and larger bets with public money, as if daring fate to notice him. Perhaps he believed his own mythology. Perhaps he understood that fraud, once begun, must constantly escalate to sustain itself. Or perhaps, most disturbingly, he simply did not care, viewing the inevitable collapse as merely another phase in a career that would continue regardless.
Watch the timber, easy now.
The market in those years was a
We're
savage,
through.
unregulated arena where fortunes evaporated overnight and new fortunes materialized from the ruins. There were no safety nets, no insurance schemes, no government interventions to cushion falls. When you gambled with other people's money and lost, those people simply lost everything. Yerkes had mastered this brutal logic with the precision of a chess master visualizing moves 20 steps ahead. But in 1871, when cities burned and markets convulsed, Charles Yerkes would make one dazzling, reckless wager with $428,000 that belonged to the people of Philadelphia. He had mastered the alchemy of moving other men's money. The question was, what happens when the market stops moving in your favor? Long before he was a magnate, Charles Tyson Yerkes was merely a prodigy of avarice. Born in 1837 to Quaker parents in Philadelphia, a city that prized sobriety yet secretly genuflected before wealth, he entered a world defined by exquisite and suffocating hypocrisy. Mid-19th century Philadelphia presented itself as a monument to moral rectitude, where the plain dress of the Friends suggested rejection of worldly ostentation, yet whose banks and counting houses hummed with the most aggressive capitalism in the Western Hemisphere. The cobblestone streets were swept clean each morning. Gas lamps illuminated orderly corners where respectable merchants conducted respectable business. And the architecture itself seemed to preach restraint.
124.
Yet beneath
Telegraph
this facade
lines
of
strung on
propriety
wooden poles.
ran currents
A
of
copper wire
ambition as
communications
fierce as
network.
any frontier
Clark's metal
boomtown.
connecting the nation.
Young Charles
Secure
learned
that line.
early
Careful
that
now.
morality was performed for those without capital,
Good heavens,
while the
look at it
true
shine.
religion of
The whole
Philadelphia
city
was
is
practiced in counting houses, where abstract numbers determined whether families prospered or starved. His father, a provision dealer and sometime banker, belonged to a faith that valued silence, inward reflection, and the rejection of worldly goods. But the boy possessed an intelligence that bypassed childhood entirely, fixing itself on the mechanisms of accumulation with the intensity of a seminarian studying sacred texts. While other children sat in the silence of the meeting house, surrounded by the devout, His mind raced not with scripture, but with the compounding interest of the sins he observed in the streets outside. At 15, he abandoned formal education to become a clerk at a grain brokerage, transforming what would have been merely tedious labor for most adolescents into a graduate education in the architecture of capitalism. In cramped offices that smelled of ink, sweat, and cigar smoke, he witnessed how fortunes could be summoned and destroyed with nothing more than a signature.
I moved the funds
Men
to the
in
Shell
silk hats
Corporation
and tailored coats.
Thank you, Mr.
Their
Clark.
faces composed
The jury
in
will
masks
consider
of
this
calm, gambled entire industries on whispers and rumors. He watched how one man's hesitation could cost him thousands, how another's
I cannot
speed
speak
could
to the
earn him
allegations
10
against my
times as
colleagues.
much.
I can
The
only
Philadelphia
reiterate
Stock
that my
Exchange
actions were
became
fully
his true
compliant with the
university,
law.
a temple where the theology of profit was practiced with religious devotion. Through tall windows, afternoon sunlight streamed in golden shafts, illuminating dust motes that danced above the heads of frantic clerks who raced between trading desks with rolled ticker tape clutched in ink-stained fingers. The air vibrated with shouted bids, the slap of palms sealing agreements, the scratch of pens recording transactions that shifted thousands of dollars from one ledger to another in seconds. Young Yerkes positioned himself in corners, observing everything, calculating constantly, learning to read the subtle signals that separated genuine confidence from desperate bluffing.
Pleasure doing business
The
with you.
revelation that would define his life crystallized during those early years. The real currency was not
Documents
gold
are in the
or
envelope.
paper,
Now get out
but
of here
time
before someone
itself.
sees us.
Gold was heavy and slow, but information was weightless and instant. If you knew before the public knew, you could own the public. Information was valuable only in the brief window between acquisition and dissemination. The man who acted in that window became rich. The man who hesitated became a cautionary tale whispered in the shadows of the exchange. The telegraph became his
votes
first
have been
real
manipulated.
accomplice.
We have
In
proof the
modest
election was
telegraph
stolen.
offices
We have to
staffed by
leave this
men whose
tonight,
fingers
before
never
the market's
ceased
open.
moving across brass keys,
The boundary
where
shifts
cigar
here,
smoke
leaving the
created
waterfront
a
to us.
perpetual
We can't
atmospheric
concede the
haze,
waterfront.
and the
We
clicking
need
of
that revenue
keys
for the
sounded like the
upcoming
heartbeat of the
election. It's already
economy.
decided.
He discovered a new theater of power.
Sign it now.
Ink-stained ledgers recorded transactions that shifted value from one coast to another. A few minutes' advantage on a bond price in New York, a slightly earlier report on a railroad's expansion, a whisper about a city council's decision on new paving contracts. These were the secrets that separated those who merely earned a living from those who devoured lives. By age 22, impossibly young by the standards of Philadelphia's financial establishment, Charles Yerkes opened his own brokerage house. The audacity was breathtaking. A boy barely old enough to vote claiming equality with men who had spent decades building reputations. Yet he possessed something they lacked, an understanding that reputation itself was merely another asset to be leveraged, bought, or manufactured as circumstances required. His specialty became municipal bonds and railroad stocks, instruments that existed at the intersection of public policy and private profit.
I'll open for 50,000.
These were not
Call,
abstract
and I'll raise
securities,
you
but
another
physical
100.
realities.
The pot is yours if you
Bonds
have the
determined
stomach for
which
it.
neighborhoods received streetlights and sewers, which districts flourished, and which decayed into slums. The key to his meteoric success lay in a relationship he cultivated with meticulous care. City Treasurer Joseph Marcer, a man whose position gave him control over Philadelphia's public funds. Marcer was a man of weak constitution and flexible morals, the perfect vessel for Yerkes' ambition. Together, they orchestrated a scheme that possessed an elegant simplicity that would have impressed a Renaissance prince. Marcer would temporarily deposit city money, tax dollars meant for streets, schools, and sewers, into Yerkes' brokerage accounts. This massive influx of public capital would then be used for private speculation,
link to the Shell
buying
company.
low
The money
and
trail
selling
stops here,
high,
but the timeline
leveraging
matches
the
the
city's
link.
own weight
Get me
to
the
tip
property
the
records by
scales in
midnight.
their favor. When investments succeeded, they would return the principal to the Treasury as if it had never left, splitting the substantial profits between them. When investments failed, there was always more city money coming in. Tax revenues, new bond issues, routine transfers, losses could be hidden, at least temporarily, in the vast opaque machinery of public finance. It was financial alchemy, creating gold out of nothing but public trust and private risk. The scheme required nerve, timing, and an absolute conviction that rules existed only for those too timid to break them. The arrangement flourished spectacularly. Philadelphia society, always hungry for new members to validate its own prosperity, embraced the young financier with enthusiasm. Custom-tailored suits began arriving from London, cut from fabric so fine it whispered against itself when he moved. He married Susanna Gamble, daughter of a respectable family, a union that conferred legitimacy more valuable than any stock certificate. They purchased a palatial mansion on Girard Avenue, one of those imposing structures that announced permanence, dynasty, arrival. Club memberships followed: the Union League, the Philadelphia Club. Sanctuaries where men who had inherited their wealth grudgingly admitted men who had stolen theirs. He became the embodiment of what Philadelphia wanted to believe about itself, that wealth and virtue were synonymous, that success proved moral superiority, that a man who prospered must have earned his prosperity through qualities worth emulating. The city saw him as proof that the system worked, that talent and industry were rewarded, that America's promise of upward mobility was real, rather than mythology designed to pacify the desperate. He walked the cobblestone streets of his Quaker neighborhoods not as a penitent, but as a conqueror, his very existence a refutation of the humility his parents had preached. Yet even during those years of triumph, Yerkes operated with a peculiar recklessness that suggested he understood the precariousness of his position. The flaw in his alchemy was the assumption of perpetual motion. The scheme required the market to breathe only in one direction, upward. It required a world without catastrophe, a timeline without interruption. He had become so enamored with his own brilliance that he forgot he was playing with fire in a room filled with paper. Then came the autumn of 1871. The air in Philadelphia grew crisp, and the leaves turned the color of dried blood. But the telegraph wires began to hum with a frantic, terrified energy. Rumors of a calamity in the West began to circulate. Stories of a lantern kicked over in a barn, of a wind that carried embers like vengeful spirits, of a city built of wood that was vanishing into ash. But in 1871, when cities burned and markets convulsed, Charles Yerkes would make one dazzling, reckless wager of $428,000 that belonged to the people of Philadelphia. He had mastered the alchemy of moving other men's money. The question was, what happens when the market stops moving in your favor? Fate, it seems, delights in irony. The Great Chicago Fire that consumed 3 square miles didn't merely burn buildings. It ignited a financial panic that would expose every hidden crime from Philadelphia to San Francisco. On the night of October 8, 1871, flames began their merciless consumption of Chicago with such biblical fury that residents fled wearing nothing but nightclothes, abandoning entire lives to be devoured by fires that painted the night sky the color of judgment. By the time the inferno exhausted itself 3 days later, 17,000 buildings had been reduced to ash, 100,000 souls rendered homeless, and the beating heart of Western commerce had stopped. But the true devastation was invisible, transmitted through telegraph wires at the speed of electricity to every financial center in the nation. In Philadelphia, the telegrams arrived in waves of escalating desperation. Stock prices collapsed as Chicago railroad bonds became worthless overnight. Insurance companies faced claims they could never honor. Municipal securities that had seemed as stable as stone suddenly traded at pennies on the dollar. The Philadelphia Stock Exchange became a theater of catastrophe, where grown men wept openly and others stood frozen in shock, unable to comprehend how events in a distant city could erase fortunes accumulated over decades. Charles Yerkes watched his carefully constructed empire disintegrate with the speed of the Chicago conflagration itself. The $428, .000 of Philadelphia's money that he held, funds extracted from taxpayers and entrusted to him through city treasurer Joseph Marcer's accommodating hand, had been gambled on securities that were now worthless. The stocks purchased with such confidence, the bonds leveraged so brilliantly, the railroad shares that had seemed destined to appreciate forever, all had become ash as surely as if the flames had consumed his brokerage house directly. Marcer arrived at Yerkes's office with the frantic energy of a man who suddenly understood that consequences were real. The arrangement that had seemed so elegant when markets rose now revealed itself as catastrophically exposed. He demanded immediate repayment. The city's books would be audited. Questions would be asked. The money needed to be returned before anyone noticed it had ever left. But the vault was empty. The capital had been transformed into promises written on paper, and those promises had burned in Chicago, even though the paper itself remained in Philadelphia. Yerkes attempted the financial acrobatics that had saved him before, borrowing from one account to cover another, floating new bonds, leveraging his reputation for one more transaction. But reputation, he discovered, was as flammable as Chicago's wooden buildings. Once the whispers began, once the first doubts surfaced, the entire structure of trust collapsed with shocking speed. Philadelphia, which had once genuflected before his apparent genius, now began to edge away as though financial ruin were contagious. On November 9, 1871, exactly 1 month after the fire began, Charles Tyson Yerkes was arrested for embezzlement, breach of trust, and misappropriation of public funds. The boy wonder of Philadelphia finance was led from his Girard Avenue mansion in handcuffs, while neighbors watched from behind lace curtains, their faces arranged in expressions of shock that barely concealed their satisfaction. There is a particular pleasure that respectable society takes in the fall of the ambitious, a vindication of their own caution, proof that those who rise too quickly deserve their inevitable descent. The trial that followed was swift and merciless, conducted with the efficiency of a system that had already reached its verdict before the first witness testified. The evidence was undeniable. Ledgers showing city funds deposited in private accounts, transaction records documenting speculation with public money, the empty treasury vault that spoke louder than any testimony. Yerkes's attorneys attempted to argue that the arrangement with Marcer had been sanctioned by custom, that such practices were common, that he had intended to return the money once markets stabilized. But intention meant nothing when the money had vanished. The courtroom became a theater of catharsis. The same upper-class Philadelphians who had nodded approvingly at his rise now relished his fall. Respectable ladies adjusted their veils and whispered behind gloved hands. Journalists sharpened their ink like knives, describing his tailored coat, his carefully controlled expression, the sudden pallor when the treasurer testified. The jury required only 1 hour to reach its decision, transforming a 34-year-old financial prodigy into a common criminal, guilty on all counts. The sentence, 2 years and 9 months in Eastern State Penitentiary, the same fortress that would later hold Al Capone. Eastern State Penitentiary rose from the Pennsylvania landscape like a medieval cathedral transported through time, its stone walls 30 feet high and 12 feet thick, designed not merely to contain but to crush the human spirit through isolation and silence. The architecture itself was a statement of philosophy, that criminals could be reformed through solitary contemplation, that separation from society would force introspection and repentance. Each cell was designed as a private purgatory, where prisoners lived alone with their thoughts and their guilt, never seeing another inmate, never hearing another voice except the guards who delivered meals through slots in iron doors. When Charles Yerkes entered that fortress wearing a tailored coat that had cost more than most prisoners earned in a year, the contrast between his former life and his new reality could not have been more absolute. The cell that became his world measured 12 feet by 8 feet, with a single barred window too high to see through, a stone floor that never warmed, and walls that wept with condensation in winter. His gilded ambition had been caged. locked behind doors that closed with the finality of a tomb being sealed. But something unexpected occurred in that stone box. Rather than breaking him, the experience crystallized his understanding of the world in ways that freedom never could. In the silence and isolation, removed from the performance of respectability that Philadelphia demanded, he saw clearly for the first time. Respectability, he realized, was not earned through virtue, but purchased through success. It vanished in a headline, dissolved in a moment, proved itself to be nothing more than a collective agreement to pretend that wealth implied worthiness. The law, he understood now, was merely another force to negotiate, another system to manipulate. It was not divine or absolute, but human and therefore corruptible. The same judges who had sentenced him belonged to clubs that had welcomed him when he was rich. The same newspapers that now called him a thief had accepted his advertisements and praised his acumen when he was profitable. The difference was not in his actions, but in their outcomes. Success was virtue. Failure was crime. He observed which guards were susceptible to small kindnesses, which administrators responded to letters from prominent Philadelphians, which priests and reformers needed a success story to justify their own existence. Even here, in this fortress of punishment, influence could be bought. He began to petition, to appeal, to maneuver, no longer moving municipal bonds across ledgers, but working with human instruments, brokers of influence, instead of capital. After 7 months, his sentence was mysteriously shortened through political influence. The same networks of power that had facilitated his crimes now secured his early release, proving that even in disgrace, a man who knew where bodies were buried retained leverage. He emerged from Eastern State Penitentiary on July 5, 1872. His conviction intact, but his illusions murdered. The man who entered that fortress had believed in the system even as he exploited it. The man who emerged understood that the system was exploitation, that there was no difference between the legitimate and the criminal except scale and success. Philadelphia society shunned him with the thoroughness of a religious excommunication. Club memberships were revoked. Former friends crossed streets to avoid greeting him. His wife, Susanna, unable to bear the social death that his conviction had inflicted upon her, filed for divorce. His brokerage license was permanently revoked. Every door that had opened for him now closed with decisive finality. He was 35 years old, a convicted felon, professionally ruined, socially destroyed, financially devastated. But he had discovered something more valuable than respectability. In America, if you steal enough, you become too important to fail. The crime was not in the theft, but in the smallness of it, in getting caught before the empire was large enough to make prosecution inconvenient. He had failed not because he was immoral, but because he had been insufficiently ambitious. Next time, he would not make the same mistake. Next time, he would steal an entire city. He looked at Philadelphia, the city of his birth, the city that had raised him up and then crushed him, and he felt nothing but contempt. It was too small, too old, too constrained by its hypocritical morality to contain the ambition that now burned within him. He needed a new canvas, a place where the rules were still being written, where the past didn't matter, where a man's worth was measured solely by the weight of his wallet and the strength of his will. Philadelphia would never again trust him. But 1,000 miles west, rising from the ashes of the very fire that had ruined him, a raw young city, violent, ambitious, and magnificently corrupt, was waiting for a man exactly like Charles T. Yerkes. Chicago in the 1880s was a city rebuilt from ashes and running on graft. The Great Fire had incinerated the old moral order. The new order was magnificently for sale. When Charles Yerkes arrived in Chicago in 1881, he found a metropolis that perfectly matched his recalibrated moral compass, a city without memory, without aristocracy, without the suffocating weight of inherited respectability that had crushed him in Philadelphia. What rose from the ruins was not a chastened town, but an industrial colossus where muddy streets were slowly hardening into boulevards. Horse-drawn streetcars clattered along uneven rails through clouds of coal smoke, and industrial smokestacks pumped prosperity and poison into the sky with equal enthusiasm. This was a place where the mud of unpaved streets mixed with the industrial slurry of stockyards, creating a coating of filth that seemed to stain not just clothing, but the very soul of the municipality. Chicago cared nothing for your past, only for what you could deliver today and what you might steal tomorrow. The men who governed it were not genteel descendants of colonial merchants, but raw operators who had clawed their way up from stockyards and rail yards, who wore their corruption as openly as their cheap suits. These aldermen called themselves boodlers, with something approaching pride, boasting openly in saloons about which contractor they had shaken down that week, which ordnance they had killed on behalf of a well-paying client. Yerkes recognized the opportunity with the clarity of a predator identifying wounded prey. Chicago's streetcar system was fragmented, dozens of small companies operating horse-drawn cars on separate lines, each holding franchises granted by aldermen who viewed public infrastructure the way farmers viewed crops, something to be harvested seasonally for personal profit. The system was a chaotic patchwork where thousands of horses defecated daily on cobblestones, worked until they collapsed, only to be dragged aside so commerce could continue. To the average citizen, it was a municipal embarrassment. To Yerkes, it was a geometry of potential power, a fragmented nervous system waiting for a brain. His method was surgical in its precision. He did not attempt to win over the public or charm existing owners.
Easy now.
First, he purchased controlling interest in the North Chicago Street Railway for pennies on the dollar, acquiring a failing enterprise whose horse-drawn cars serviced the north side with equipment so decrepit that passengers joked they could walk faster than the animals pulling them. But Yerkes wasn't buying transportation, he was buying the franchise, the legal right to operate on specific streets, the governmental permission that was worth infinitely more than the rusting equipment. Then he went shopping for politicians. In Chicago's city council chambers, where aldermen gathered in wrinkled suits beneath a permanent haze of cigar smoke, Yerkes found a marketplace more efficient than any stock exchange he had known. He walked into smoke-filled backrooms where the air was thick with cheap cigars and stale beer, and he laid out a business proposition, breathtaking in its clarity. He did not offer vague promises of civic improvement. He offered cash. Yerkes established a price list that became the unspoken constitution of Chicago politics. A simple vote on a routine matter cost $500, delivered in cash in an envelope passed beneath the table during committee hearings. A committee chairmanship, which gave control over which bills reached the floor, cost $5,000, killing a competitor's franchise application, ensuring that Yerkes faced no rivals on his routes, commanded $25,000, paid in installments to saloons and hotel rooms where aldermen conducted their actual business. The payments were made with the casual efficiency of men buying vegetables at a market, treating bribery as a standard operating expense, no different from the cost of coal or steel rails. Within 2 years, he had assembled a coalition of purchased votes sufficient to dominate every decision affecting transit franchises. Within 5 years, he controlled virtually all North and West Side streetcar operations, consolidating dozens of small companies into an empire that moved hundreds of thousands of Chicagoans daily. But Yerkes was not content merely to operate the system he had stolen. He transformed it with the same ruthless efficiency he had applied to its acquisition. The suffering horses were banished, replaced first by cable cars and then by the terrifying new magic of electricity. He elevated the tracks above the streets, creating the iconic loop system that would define Chicago's skyline. Massive steel structures rose like dark cages over the avenues, their riveted skeletons glistening with coal soot and rain. Workers labored day and night, the sound of hammered steel echoing between tenements as pillars were sunk into the earth and tracks threaded through the city's heart. The construction was brutal, Workers died in falls from elevated
I admit it, Your
platforms.
Honor.
Neighborhoods
I
were
moved the funds to
bisected
the
by
Shell
steel
Corporation
pillars,
myself.
and property
Thank you, Mr.
values
Clark.
collapsed
The jury
beneath the
will consider
tracks
this
while
submission.
soaring near the stations. His philosophy of operation was stated with remarkable candor. The secret of success in my business is to buy old junk,
I cannot
fix it up a
speak to
little,
the
and
allegations
unload
against
it
my
upon
colleagues.
other fellows.
I can only reiterate that
He
my
paid
actions
his
were
workers
fully
starvation
compliant with
wages,
the law.
packed streetcars beyond any reasonable capacity, passengers crushed together so tightly that pickpockets worked the cars with impunity, and charged maximum fares that consumed a significant portion of a working man's daily wage. He viewed his passengers not as customers to be served, but as scrap hangers, livestock to be packed into cars until the density of bodies maximized revenue per square foot. Complaints were silenced through systematic bribery of newspaper editors, who either accepted his advertising dollars and muted their criticism, or found themselves facing mysterious legal troubles. By 1890, Charles
It's done,
Yerkes
man.
had become Chicago's
Pleasure doing
fourth
business with you.
richest man, commanding a paper fortune estimated
money all
at
here.
$7
Every
million.
cent.
The
His
documents are
Michigan
in the
Avenue
envelope.
mansion
Now get out of here
became a
before someone
fortress
sees
of
us.
stolen beauty. Walls lined with Renaissance masterpieces purchased not through legitimate dealers, but through European brokers who specialized in moving art of questionable provenance. Behind limestone walls, he assembled a collection that rivaled European museums. Rembrandt's hung beside Rubens. Titian's gazed down from gilded frames, each painting a testament to the fact that embezzled funds, if spent quickly enough and
Votes
far
have
enough
been
from their
manipulated.
source, could
We have
purchase
proof
anything.
the election was stolen.
He used
We
the
have to
nickels
leak
of
this
Chicago's
tonight,
working
before
poor
the market's
to
open.
acquire the beauty of the old world,
boundary shifts
walking
here,
through
leaving the
galleries
waterfront
lined
to
with
us.
masterpieces.
We can't concede the
A
waterfront.
man with the
We need
soul
that
of a
revenue
ledger
for the
clerk,
upcoming election.
surrounded
It's
by the
already
sublime.
decided.
He divorced his second wife with the same
Sign it now.
cold efficiency he applied to business transactions, replacing her with Emily Grigsby, a blonde beauty 40 years his junior, who called him Daddy and served as the ornamental centerpiece of glittering soirs. These parties were performances of legitimacy, attempts to purchase through ostentation what Philadelphia had once granted through birth. The affair was conducted with brazen openness that shocked even Chicago's hardened sensibilities, as he showered her with diamonds and real estate while parading her through opera houses as the city's matrons clutched their pearls in horror. The newspapers began calling him the Traction Tyrant, a title that was meant as condemnation, but which Yerkes seemed to wear with perverse pride. Editorial cartoons depicted him as an octopus with tentacles wrapped around City Hall, as a vampire draining the blood of working families. Chicago's old elite, the meatpacking kings like Armour and retail
open
giants like
50,000.
Field,
Call,
despised him.
and I'll raise you
They
another
were
100.
ruthless men
The pot is
themselves,
yours if you have the
but they
stomach
cloaked
for
their
it.
greed in philanthropy and civic duty. Yerkes stripped away the mask, becoming the naked face of what they all truly were, and they hated him for it. Yet none of it mattered. By 1895, Yerkes owned 22 aldermen outright, his gray wolves, so called because they hunted in packs and showed no mercy to prey. These men voted as a bloc on every measure affecting his interests, killing competitors' applications, extending his franchises, blocking reform efforts. When reformers managed to elect honest aldermen,
Read the Evening
Yerkes
Star.
simply purchased
Shocking
them or
scandal.
destroyed them
Public
through
official
orchestrated
indicted.
scandals.
All the details
He had
right
learned
here.
democracy's essential truth. People vote, but aldermen count. And he owned the counters. His power seemed absolute, his
We need to
position
verify this link to
unassailable.
the Shell Company.
The
He
money trail
controlled the
stops here,
arteries
but the
through which
timeline
Chicago's
matches the link.
lifeblood flowed,
Get me the property records by
extracting
midnight.
wealth from every journey, every commute, every desperate worker trying to reach a factory before the whistle blew. He had built a machine that seemed unstoppable. The nickels flowed in a ceaseless river. The politicians stayed bought, and the trains ran on his schedule. He had proven
It
that
is
a
by
man
the
with
goodness
enough
of
money
God
and
that
no
in our
shame
country we have
could
those
bend an
three
entire
unspeakably
metropolis to his
precious
will,
things.
fortified by a wall of graft so high that no reformer could climb it. But it is the nature of greed that it cannot recognize a ceiling. It only sees the next floor. He possessed franchises that ran for 20 or 30 years, but that was not enough. He wanted immortality. He wanted to secure his empire, not just for his life, but for generations. The very completeness of his control-bred resentment that transcended class boundaries, creating vulnerabilities in the foundation of his seemingly impregnable fortress. Then Yerkes made his fatal miscalculation. He demanded something unprecedented, a 99-year monopoly that would make him untouchable. Instead, it would destroy him. February 1897. The Illinois legislature convened in Springfield to consider two bills drafted by Yerkes' attorneys, the Humphrey Bill and the Allen Bill. Together, they would grant him a 99-year stranglehold on Chicago's transportation, a monopoly lasting until 1996. The legislation was elegant in its audacity, crafted with the precision of men who understood that law was merely another instrument to be played.
Devise, and
buried
all
beneath
the rest,
dense bureaucratic language designed to bore the average citizen into submission,
Thomas.
lay a terrifying simplicity. The Humphrey Bill would extend all existing streetcar franchises to 99 years, transforming temporary permissions into what amounted to permanent ownership. The Allen Bill would grant the city council, his city council, his purchased aldermen, the power to approve these extensions without public referendum. Together, they formed a legal fortress that would outlast his grandchildren, surviving into an unimaginable future where the 20th century would be nearly exhausted. Yerkes had prepared for this moment with the thoroughness of a general laying siege to a fortress. He had spent $500,000 bribing state legislators, an astronomical sum in an era when a working man earned less in a lifetime than Yerkes spent on a single vote. The money flowed through Springfield like a river of corruption, delivered in leather satchels to hotel rooms, passed in envelopes during late-night meetings in saloons that reeked of whiskey and desperation. The corridors of the state capitol were thick with his agents, dispensing envelopes, promising patronage, arranging futures with the casual efficiency of men buying commodities at market. He owned the votes. He owned Governor John Peter Altgeld, whose silence had been purchased with promises of future support. He owned the machinery of the state itself. The calculus, as he saw it, was simple. Transit franchises currently ran for 20 or 30 years, requiring constant renegotiation, constant risk. But a 99-year extension, effectively perpetual control, would turn a volatile business into a dynastic asset. The bonds he floated in London would become irresistible if anchored by a lease stretching almost to the next century. Citizens, he believed, could be ignored, as they always had been. He had never truly been denied anything he purchased, but Charles Yerkes had fatally underestimated the public's capacity for rage. He had grown so accustomed to viewing citizens as livestock, straff hangers to be packed into cars and milked for nickels, that he failed to recognize they were also voters with memories, workers with grievances, and human beings with a breaking point. For 16 years, Chicago had tolerated his corruption because it seemed abstract, distant, inevitable. But a 99-year monopoly was not abstract. It was a declaration that their children and their children's children would be his captives, riding his trains, paying his fares, enriching his heirs until the next century was nearly dead. Chicago exploded with a fury that shocked even the city's most cynical observers. The eruption began not with the poor, but with the newspapers, those same publications that had accepted his bribes for years, suddenly discovering principles they had forgotten they possessed. The Chicago Tribune, which had muted its criticism in exchange for advertising revenue, published an editorial that called the proposed legislation the most brazen theft in legislative history. The headline screamed across the front page in letters so large they seemed to vibrate with outrage. Editorial cartoons depicted Yerkes as a bloated spider trapping the city in a web of steel, or as a vampire draining the blood of working families. Reform groups that had operated on the margins of civic life suddenly found themselves commanding audiences of thousands. The Municipal Voters League, the Civic Federation, church groups, labor unions, women's clubs, organizations that normally disagreed on everything, unified around a single demand: stop Yerkes. Mass meetings were organized in theaters and churches, where speakers described the 99-year monopoly in terms that made it comprehensible to every listener. Your children will ride his trains. Your grandchildren will pay his fares. Your great-grandchildren will still be enriching his estate when you are dust. Workers threatened strikes that would paralyze the city. Business leaders who had tolerated Yerke's corruption, who had themselves profited from the aldermen he controlled, now saw him as a threat to civic order itself. Marshall Field, the retail magnate whose own business practices were ruthless, publicly condemned the bills. Even the meatpacking kings, men who treated immigrant workers like disposable machinery, joined the opposition. Yerkes had violated an unspoken rule of Gilded Age capitalism: steal, yes, but do it quietly enough that the masses remain pacified. The rage built through March like a thunderstorm gathering strength, and by early April, it had become a force that could not be contained by police or politicians. On April 5, 1897, 10,000 Chicagoans marched on City Hall, carrying signs that made their intentions brutally clear. They came from the tenements of the West Side and the brownstones of the North Side. Factory workers in flat caps standing shoulder to shoulder with cloaks and bowler hats. They carried torches that cast long, dancing shadows against the stone facades of government buildings, creating a hellish tableau that seemed to illuminate the very soul of municipal corruption. They carried ropes, and they carried signs, hastily painted but unequivocal in their message. Hong Yerkes, no 99-year steal, and the streets belong to the people. The crowd was so vast that police lines buckled almost immediately. Nightsticks, so often deployed to shatter strikes, now seemed useless against this tide. The roar of the mob penetrated the thick stone walls of the council chambers, a terrifying, incoherent sound like the approach of judgment itself. Inside the city council chambers, the spectacle was even more remarkable. Yerkes' gray wolves, those 22 aldermen he owned outright, sat in their chairs with the pallor of men who had suddenly remembered they possessed mortal bodies. They looked out the windows and saw a sea of angry faces illuminated by torchlight, a physical manifestation of the consequences they had always assumed they could avoid. Mayor Carter Harrison Jr., a reformer who had ridden the wave of anti-Yerkes sentiment into office, watched the proceedings with grim satisfaction. He knew that bribery worked best in the dark. It withered under the glare of 10,000 torches. The emergency session began with the gavel pounding in a futile attempt to impose decorum. Voices rose. Accusations flew. Reform aldermen, long marginalized, now spoke with the amplified confidence of 10,000 throats outside. The collapse happened with shocking speed. One by one, the Grey Wolves began to panic, their carefully constructed loyalty evaporating in the face of genuine physical danger. The first switched his vote with a clumsy speech about new information. The second invoked the will of the people. A third claimed he had been misled about the bill's contents. Each justification was a flimsy veil thrown hastily over naked fear. The machine that Yerkes had built, carefully calibrated, ruthlessly enforced, began to come apart at its seams in real time, like a badly riveted rail car shuddering under too much weight. The bills died in committee, killed by the very men Yerkes had purchased. The 99-year monopoly was defeated. For the first time in 20 years, bribery had failed Charles Tyson Yerkes. The catastrophe rippled through his empire with a speed that astonished even him. The defeat at City Hall shattered the aura of invincibility that had been his greatest asset. In the world of high finance and low politics, power is a perception. Once men believed Yerkes could be beaten, he was already finished. He tried desperately to salvage what he could, employing every trick in his extensive repertoire. He offered to sell his streetcar companies to the city at wildly inflated prices, attempting to convert political defeat into financial coup. The city, emboldened by its victory and smelling blood, refused. He attempted to float new bonds to refinance the crushing debt he had accumulated during his expansion, presenting Chicago Traction as a maturing utility rather than a speculative gamble. Wall Street and London investors, sensing the toxicity of his name, now turned away. He tried bribing new aldermen, offering sums even larger than before, hoping to find fresh recruits for his wolf pack. They refused, not out of virtue, but out of terror that the next mob would be larger and less forgiving. His Michigan Avenue mansion, that fortress of stolen beauty, became a prison of anxiety. The lights burned late into the night as he met with attorneys and accountants, trying to find some legal maneuver that could salvage the situation. Art began to be crated for shipment, Rembrandts and Titians wrapped in cloth and packed in wooden boxes. Each masterpiece a reminder that beauty purchased with stolen money could be lost as quickly as it was acquired. Emily Grigsby, his blonde mistress who had called him daddy during the years of triumph, now looked at him with eyes that calculated her own survival, wondering if she should flee before the mansion was seized. The final accounting was brutal. His paper fortune of $7 million evaporated as stock prices collapsed and creditors circled like vultures. The transit empire he had spent 16 years assembling was sold in pieces for a fraction of its value to investors, who understood that Yerkes' name had become poison. On October 12, 1899, Charles Tyson Yerkes sold the controlling interests in his Chicago streetcar empire for roughly $10 million, a fortune to any other man, but a pittance compared to the dynastic wealth he had sought. He was 62 years old, driven from two cities, his reputation destroyed in Philadelphia and Chicago both. As he prepared to board the train departing for New York, the city did not mourn him. There were no testimonials, no farewell dinners, no editorials praising his vision. There was only relief. He sat in that private rail car surrounded by leather and cut glass, moving eastward through fields and towns illuminated by the very technologies he had helped accelerate, leaving behind a city transformed by his ambition, but utterly rejecting his memory. He was a man without a home, a king without a country, an exile in his own land. Most men would retire after two catastrophic failures, but Yerkes wasn't most men. His mind, even as the train pulled out of Union Station, was not dwelling on the past, but scanning the horizon for the next opportunity, the next vulnerability, the next system to exploit. If American cities had learned to fight back, he would find a city that hadn't learned yet and build his greatest empire beneath its very streets. London in 1900 was the largest city in the world, and its transportation system belonged in the Middle Ages. The existing underground lines were steam-powered, filthy, and lethal. The city desperately needed a visionary. Instead, it got Charles T. Yerkes. Edwardian London sprawled across the Thames Basin like a living organism that had grown too large for its own circulation system. 6 million souls pressed together in a metropolis where fog mixed with coal smoke to create a permanent twilight, where gas lamps flickered against the perpetual gloom, and where horse-drawn omnibuses crowded narrow streets designed for sedan chairs and medieval carts. The few underground lines that existed were Victorian nightmares, steam locomotives belching sulfurous smoke through brick tunnels that lacked proper ventilation, coating passengers in soot and forcing them to breathe air that was often described as lethal. Workers called the system the sewer, and the nickname was not entirely metaphorical.
124. Telegraph
Passengers
lines strung
emerged
on
from
wooden
stations
poles.
blackened
A copper
and
wire
gasping,
communications
their
network.
lungs burning
Clark's
from the
metal
toxic
connecting the
mixture
nation.
of
Secure
coal
that
smoke
line.
and
Careful now.
subterranean fumes. When
Good
Charles
heavens,
Yerkes
look at it
crossed the
shine.
Atlantic
The
after
whole
his
city is
expulsion from
next.
Chicago, he arrived not as a disgraced American robber, but as something London found perversely fascinating, the embodiment of New World dynamism. He carried letters of introduction from respectable American banking houses and spoke in the confident, rapid tones of a man used to bending institutions to his will. To British investors unfamiliar with the intricacies of Chicago municipal politics, or willfully uninterested in investigating them, He presented himself as a pioneering American engineer who had modernized Chicago's transit system with electric trains and elevated tracks. They saw his gray hair and dignified bearing and assumed they were dealing with a statesman of commerce. They did not know they were shaking hands with a 63-year-old con man executing his final, most audacious scheme. The British aristocracy and the City of London's financial elite were unfamiliar with terms like traction tyrant or the concept of boodling. They saw only a man who spoke fluently about electrical systems, tunnel construction, and passenger capacity calculations.
The jury will consider
all
the
knowledge
submission.
genuinely accumulated during his Chicago years. His tailored suits were impeccable, his manner confident, his technical expertise impressive.
I cannot speak to
What
the
they could not
allegations
have
against
known
my colleagues.
without
I can only
transatlantic
reiterate
investigations
that my
that
actions
seemed
were fully
unnecessary
compliant
for a
with the
man
law.
bearing such impressive credentials was that they were not meeting a visionary engineer, but a master of financial alchemy seeking one final transformation. Yerkes immediately identified the same structural vulnerability in London that he had exploited in Chicago: fragmentation. The underground system was a collection of bankrupt or struggling companies holding rights to dig tunnels they couldn't afford to build. He formed the Underground Electric Railways Company of London, a name that sounded stable, imperial, and permanent. Through this entity and its satellites, he orchestrated the largest corporate financing in British history, raising an eye-watering £18 million pounds sterling.
Pleasure doing business
The
with you.
scale of the undertaking was pharaonic. He acquired the rights to what would become the Bakerloo, Piccadilly, and Northern Lines, promising to electrify and unify London's subterranean transport into a modern marvel that would rival anything on Earth. In mahogany-paneled boardrooms where champagne toasts celebrated milestones and fountain pens scratched promises onto vellum, Yerkes dazzled investors with his vision of a gleaming, electric future. He spoke of clean trains whisking millions beneath the streets in quiet comfort, of distinctive red-tiled stations that would become instant landmarks,
stolen.
of a unified system that would drag London bodily into the 20th
Boundary
century.
shifts here, leaving the
British
waterfront to
investors,
us.
We can't
accustomed
concede the
to
waterfront.
imperial
We need
projects
that
measured
revenue for
in
the upcoming
millions,
election.
found the
It's already
scale
decided.
reassuring rather than alarming. They
Sign
examined
it
his
now.
contracts, listened to his presentations, observed the confidence with which he dismissed concerns, and opened their wallets to fund what they believed would be their greatest civic achievement. Remarkably, he delivered, partially. The lines were actually constructed, and the construction followed a scale that justified the word pharaonic. Thousands of workers descended by lantern light into the bowels of the earth, carving out the tube tunnels that would define the city's geography for the next century. Shafts were sunk deep into London clay, that thick, dark geological layer that had supported the city for millennia. Workers battled flooding, gas pockets, and the sheer logistical madness of tunneling beneath a metropolis that could not stop moving. Electric trains, gleaming, modern, revolutionary, were installed on tracks that curved through the darkness like steel veins. Stations were built with tile work and architectural
I'll
flourishes
open for 50,000.
designed by Leslie
Call,
Green,
and I'll
their
raise you
oxblood
another 100.
fades becoming
The pot is
instant
yours if you have the
landmarks
stomach
that
for it.
still define London street corners today. But Yerkes was simultaneously employing his Chicago playbook with ruthless efficiency. Construction costs were systematically inflated, with materials purchased through shell companies he controlled at prices far above market rate. He awarded construction contracts to his own entities at prices that guaranteed profit regardless of the railway's actual performance. Management fees were exorbitant, siphoning millions into accounts that bore no scrutiny from investors who trusted in his American expertise. He watered the stock, issuing shares that represented hope rather than assets. He was building a real transit system while simultaneously embezzling from it, creating
We need to
genuine
verify this link to
infrastructure
the shell
while
company.
stealing
The
from
money
the
trail
very
stops here,
investors
but the
who
timeline
had
matches the
trusted
leak.
him with their
Get me the
fortunes.
property records by
With
midnight.
millions flowing from London, he constructed his final fortress on Fifth Avenue in New York, a 60-room mansion that served as both palace and mausoleum. This house, stuffed floor to ceiling with the spoils of his decades-long campaign against decency, contained an art collection
It is
valued
by the
at
goodness
$3
of
million.
God that in our country we have
Rembrandts,
those three
Titians, and
unspeakably
Rubens
precious
shared
things.
wall space with Flemish tapestries and French bronzes, each object a trophy in his private war against a world that had once locked him in a stone cell. He walked through galleries of masterpieces, a man who had built nothing beautiful himself, but who had surrounded himself with the beauty others created, purchased with money extracted from the nickels of Chicago workers and the pounds of London investors. In Wisconsin, far from the cities he had corrupted, stood his one genuine contribution to human knowledge, the Yerkes Observatory, home to a 40-inch refracting telescope that was the largest in the world. He had donated it to the University of Chicago during his Chicago ascendancy, seeking the immortality that philanthropy supposedly conferred. The telescope bore his name in bronze letters, pointing toward stars whose light had traveled for centuries to reach the lens. It was an instrument of sublime purpose built with sublimely dirty money, gazing at the infinite while anchored in theft, a characteristic hedge, a bribe paid to science to launder a reputation that commerce had stained. But the body, that inconvenient vessel of mortality that no amount of money could truly purchase or repair, began its inevitable rebellion. Decades of stress, the constant calculations, the fear of exposure, the midnight meetings with politicians, the exhausting performance of confidence had destroyed his kidneys. The rich foods and expensive wines of countless banquets, the cigars smoked in boardrooms, the physical toll of maintaining an empire built on lies, all accumulated into a systemic failure that no physician could reverse. By 1905, the man who had electrified Chicago and London was running out of energy, his organs failing as his paper empire crumbled in parallel, as if fate insisted on symmetry between the corruption of his body and the corruption of his business. The final months were spent in that Fifth Avenue fortress, surrounded by stolen masterpieces that now seemed to mock him with their permanence. The art would outlast him. The telescope would outlast him. Even the transit lines, built through fraud, would outlast him. But his name, his reputation, his carefully constructed persona, all of it was dissolving like smoke in wind. Emily Grigsby, the mistress who had called him daddy during the prosperous years, now hovered at the edges, calculating her own survival, wondering what she might salvage from the wreckage. On December 29, 1905, in his Fifth Avenue fortress, surrounded by stolen masterpieces and the ever-present Emily Grigsby, Charles Tyson Yerkes died of kidney failure. He was 68 years old, the man who had purchased legislators as casually as cigars, who had bullied aldermen and seduced investors, went out not in handcuffs, not before a judge, but alone in bed, smothered by silence and the careful politeness of servants waiting just beyond the door. No family gathered at his bedside. No friends held his hand. Only lawyers waited, ready to begin the division of spoils. Death did not ennoble him. It simply opened the gates to the final feeding frenzy. The vultures descended with the efficiency of a well-run syndicate, armed with contracts and claims as sharp as knives. His estate, so carefully architected in life, was immediately seized by creditors, trustees, and lawyers. The art collection that he had assembled as a bulwark against oblivion went under the hammer in a 12-day auction at the American Art Association that drew the very society that had once shunned him. The Rembrandts and Titians, those silent witnesses to his appetites, were dispersed to other walls, other families, other stories. The Fifth Avenue mansion itself, 60 rooms of marble, silk, and malice, was sold and eventually demolished. Emily Grigsby received $850,000 in the initial settlement, a fortune that should have secured her future. She lost it all within 2 years to lawsuits from other claimants, eventually fleeing to Europe to live out her days in the fading glamour of the French Riviera. His abandoned first wife received nothing. His children, scattered and estranged, received nothing. Yet his rails remained. Beneath London, the tunnels he financed continued to hum with electric life. The Bakerloo and Piccadilly lines that Yerkes had built continued to operate, carrying millions of passengers through stations whose oxblood fades still mark London street corners. The systems he had stitched together through greed had become necessities, so deeply entwined with the existence of the city that removing them would have been unthinkable. Every rush hour, bodies pressed into carriages that raced through tunnels he financed with other people's money, guided by signals installed at his behest, moving through the subterranean arteries he had created while systematically looting the investors who trusted him. The underground lines he built still carry 4 million passengers daily. But his name appears nowhere. No plaque, no statue, no memorial. The city he built forgot him deliberately. Today, 5 million souls ride the systems Charles Yerkes built. The Chicago elevated trains rattle around the loop on routes he assembled through systematic bribery, their steel wheels shrieking against rails financed with cash, delivered in envelopes to aldermen in smoke-filled saloons. The London Underground remains Britain's circulatory system, pumping millions through tunnels he carved, while systematically looting his investors. Its oxblood-tiled stations still bearing the architectural signature of his American ambition. The Yerkes Observatory peers deeper into space than almost any instrument on Earth. Its 40-inch lens capturing light from stars that died before humans learned to write. These are not ruins or monuments. They are living, breathing engines of civilization that function every hour of every day, carrying nurses to hospitals, students to universities, workers to factories that produce goods improving lives he never considered. Yet his name appears on none of them.
Wire communications
This is not the common fate of being forgotten by time.
Secure that line.
But something
Careful now.
far more deliberate. A surgical
Good
excision
heavens, look at it
performed by the
shine.
very
The
cities
whole
he
city is
reshaped.
next.
Chicago renamed his lines, scrubbing his identity from maps and station signs with the thoroughness of a civilization, erasing a pharaoh from temple walls. London never acknowledged him at all, absorbing his capital and organizational genius while maintaining a stony silence about the man himself, as if the underground had emerged from collective will rather than one man's ruthless ambition. The observatory bears his name only because it is literally engraved in bronze on the building, a permanent reminder that even sublime instruments can be purchased with sublimely dirty money, forcing astronomers to speak the name of a convicted felon every time they chart the heavens. This represents the most exquisite form of historical justice. His ghost haunts every tunnel, every elevated platform, every signal that changes from red to green. Yet he receives no credit, no gratitude, no remembrance. The millions who tap their cards and rush through turnstiles remain blissfully ignorant of his existence, inheriting the infrastructure he built for himself
moved the funds
while
to the Shell
remaining
Corporation
utterly indifferent
myself.
to his
Thank
memory.
you, Mr. Clark.
Charles
The jury
Yerkes
will
once
consider this
declared,
admission.
with the brutal honesty that occasionally punctured his performances of respectability, "It is the straff hangers who pay the dividends." He meant it literally, not as
I
metaphor
cannot
but as
speak to the
operating
allegations
doctrine.
against my colleagues.
Pack the
I
trains
can only
beyond any
reiterate that
reasonable
my actions
capacity,
were fully
charge
compliant with the
maximum
law.
fares that consume a significant portion of a working man's daily wage, extract every possible penny from the working class, and distribute the proceeds to shareholders, which meant primarily to himself. This was pure Gilded Age theology, the unspoken philosophy of an era that viewed the public not as citizens to be served, but as a natural resource to be mined until exhausted. Democracy in this framework was merely a marketplace where votes could be purchased like commodities. Laws were suggestions to be ignored by those with sufficient capital. The masses existed to be exploited, nothing more. Yet here lies the final, crushing irony
It's done,
that
man.
history has visited upon his
Pleasure
memory.
doing business with you.
The systems he built to enrich himself have enriched
the money
millions
all
of
here?
others in
Every
ways he
cent.
never
The
intended and
documents
could
are in
never
the
have
envelope.
understood.
Now get out of here before
The
someone
trains
sees
he
us.
viewed as profit extraction machines became the arteries of modern civilization, allowing cities to expand vertically and horizontally, economies to flourish, and ordinary people to traverse vast distances for the price of a few coins. The infrastructure he assembled through bribery, theft, and extortion now serves the public good with a fidelity he would have found incomprehensible. Every morning, Office workers in
votes have been
London descend
manipulated.
into
We have
stations
proof the
faced with
election was
trials he
stolen.
commissioned.
We have to leave
Their
this
minds
tonight,
occupied with
before the market's
mundane
open.
concerns, meetings,
The boundary
deadlines,
shifts here,
groceries,
leaving the waterfront
utterly
to us.
unaware
We
that
can't
the
concede
tunnels
the
carrying them
waterfront.
were
We need that
financed
revenue
by
for
a
the
man
upcoming
who viewed
election.
their
It's already
grandparents as
decided.
nothing more than livestock to be milked
Sign it
for
now.
nickels. Infrastructure, once constructed, develops purposes beyond its creator's vision. A tunnel dug to maximize profit becomes a route to opportunity. Tracks laid to extract revenue from the poor become pathways to employment, education, and escape. The systems took on lives of their own, evolving beyond the narrow, grasping vision of the man who assembled them, serving purposes he would have found irrelevant or contemptible. He built a cage to trap the city's wealth, but the cities took the cage, unlocked the doors, and used it to build metropolises that transcended his imagination. The verdict of history is therefore both complex and unforgiving. Charles Yerkes proved you can steal a fortune through systematic fraud, purchase an entire city's government with leather satchels full of cash, and construct an empire that shapes millions of lives. But you cannot buy a legacy. You cannot bribe history. You cannot steal your way into immortality.
And I'll raise
History
you another
is a
100.
judge that
The
cannot
pot
be
is
bought
yours
with
if you have the
municipal
stomach for
bonds or silenced with hush money. An auditor that eventually closes every ledger and renders accounts that no amount of wealth can alter. The Gilded Age produced dozens of men exactly like Yerkes, titans who believed laws were suggestions, that regulation was an insult, that the Republic itself was a commodity to be bought and sold. But many of them eventually understood a truth that escaped Yerkes entirely. Money eventually smells of its origins unless it is washed in the waters of philanthropy. Carnegie, Rockefeller, and Vanderbilt learned to launder their reputations through strategic giving, building libraries, universities, and foundations that allowed future generations to remember them as complicated figures whose crimes were balanced
We need to
against
verify
their
this link to the
contributions.
shell company.
The money
They
trail
traded their
stops
gold
here,
for
but the timeline
respectability,
matches the leak.
buying their way
Give me the
back
property
into the
records
good
by
graces
midnight.
of history through monuments to human betterment. Yerkes built nothing but transit lines and took everything else. He offered no apology, sought no redemption, and left behind no great charitable trust to scrub his name clean. His one attempt at philanthropy, the observatory,
It
was
is by the
transparently
goodness of God that in our
transactional,
country
a bribe
we have
paid to
those
science
three
rather than a
unspeakably
gift
precious
to
things.
humanity. He remained a predator until the end, refusing to wear sheep's clothing even when the hunters closed in. Consequently, he is remembered not as a titan, but as a thief, not as a builder, but as a cautionary tale about the naked face of capitalism without the mask of civic virtue. His telescope still points toward the stars, a monument to a man who spent his life staring into the gutter, searching for something to steal. It stands in the cold, clear air of Wisconsin, a giant eye of glass and steel turned toward the infinite, capturing light that has traveled for millennia, only to fall upon an instrument paid for with money stolen from men who never saw the night sky without industrial smoke. Astronomers conduct their research, publish their papers, make genuine contributions to human understanding beneath the word Yerkes carved in stone, most never pausing to consider the life behind the letters. It is the perfect symbol of his existence, a mechanism of sublime purpose funded by base crimes, looking upward while rooted in theft, seeing farther than human eyes can comprehend, yet unable to illuminate the darkness at the center of its creator's motivations. The telescope sees into the past by capturing ancient light, yet it cannot see the man
I
who
hereby
paid for
give,
it,
devise,
cannot
and
answer the
bequeath all
question
the
of
rest,
whether a
residue,
beautiful
and
thing
remainder
built
of my
with ugly
estate,
money
both real
is
and
itself
personal, to my
beautiful or
nephew
ugly.
Thomas.
Perhaps that is the most fitting memorial a man like him could have, a name attached to a device that looks outward into eternity, while history turns inward and quietly forgets the man who commissioned it. In the end, Charles Tyson Yerkes received exactly what he paid for. Everything and nothing at all. He accumulated millions, controlled cities, built systems that have outlasted him by more than a century. He owned aldermen like other men owned horses, purchased legislators with casual efficiency, bent entire municipalities to his will through systematic application of cash and intimidation. He lived in palaces, surrounded himself with stolen masterpieces, kept mistresses young enough to be his granddaughters, and died in a bed that cost more than most men earned in lifetimes. Yet he has no legacy in any sense that would have mattered to him. His children scattered, estranged and empty-handed, his fortune evaporated within months of his death, dispersed to creditors and lawyers like smoke and wind. His art collection was auctioned and scattered to walls that would never know his name. His mansion was demolished and replaced by buildings that serve purposes he never imagined. Even his grave is unremarkable, a simple marker visited by no one except occasional historians researching corruption rather than paying respects. The trains still run on schedule, their wheels singing against rails he laid, carrying passengers who owe him nothing and know him not at all. The vast, complex choreography of urban transit continues without pause, signals changing from red to green, doors sliding open and shut, millions of daily journeys made possible by infrastructure he created, but no longer owns in any meaningful sense. The name is forgotten, scrubbed from maps and guidebooks, absent from plaques and memorials. Time, that commodity he spent 40 years trying to purchase through 99-year franchises and perpetual rights of way, has rendered its final judgment with the indifference of natural law. And somewhere in the archives of discarded men, filed among the forgotten robber barons and expired tyrants, Charles Yerkes waits in the darkness he built for himself, right on time and utterly alone.